They say, are the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the Senate, and joined here by my House colleagues. And I guess I'll just start off by saying we are in the 5th week of the legislative session, so for budget writers, that mostly entails the grind of going through the governor's budget and reviewing what the executive branch and the judicial branches thought were priorities for them, and kind of digging into all of that with a fine-tooth comb. They put together their budgets in September, so economy's changed, things have changed, so we update their numbers, check to see if their priorities are our priorities, and then try to squeeze out savings in their budget so that we in turn can have resources to invest in things that the legislature thinks are important. With Democratic majorities, there's overlap for us, so I think it's not as challenging as in a split kind of a government. The good news, I would say, is that we're in a really solid place. The state economy is strong, especially in comparison to the rest of the country. We're the only state in the nation that does budget planning on a 4-year basis, literally the only one. So when we're talking about tax cuts or spending increases, we have a formula that spits out what that would look like over 4 years. And similarly, when we're in a situation like we are right now with a really constrained workforce, we can say things like, we know we want to invest in early childhood learning, but we don't have a workforce to hire 2,000 child care workers today, but we know that's a plan, so we can phase in funding for that in a responsible way, rather than funding something where the money won't get spent. And then we can see how that looks over 4 years. So with all of that, we're in a really strong place. And I think an exciting thing for budget writers, but not for anybody else, is that we'll be paying off our pension obligations this budget cycle. And how that translates is it means $1 billion less in pension payments that the state budget has to make to catch up with decades earlier when the legislature underfunded pensions. So Drew and I were both talking with the Association of Washington Cities today, and that translates for them into like $500 million in savings at the local government level. So it's good news, but nobody else really tracks that. But having said that, that puts us in the position of like one of maybe 3 states in the country that has a fully funded pension system. So that's not dragging down our credit ratings and our long-term forecasts for healthy budget situations. I guess really briefly, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues, I think that what the Senate budget writers are looking at is not very different than what the governor's looking at and what the House leadership is looking at. We need to make significant new investments in special education, and I'll just say with no disrespect intended, when you sneeze in the K-12 realm, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars. So investments in special education translate into a $500 to $2 billion investment, depending on how you look at that. All throughout the budget, and especially in K-12, the state is obligated under the Clery agreement and the state constitution. Salaries have to keep up with inflation. So that's another new expense in this budget because we hadn't anticipated the high inflation rates last year when we left Olympia. So in the K-12 space, we have very big investments that aren't necessarily for new things. There are just state obligations to school districts to follow our commitments. We're also affordable housing, and homelessness continues to be a challenge, so that's something that we'll be talking about, and there'll be big new investments in that. Workforce training and making sure we're aligning our workforce with what employers and the state government needs is another priority. And the behavioral health that you heard our majority and minority leaders talking about, investing in substance use disorders, opioid treatment, mental health treatment, the True Blood decision, which is a serious problem in our state in terms of providing treatment for people who are Nicole can say this better than me, that are in the courts, in the criminal justice system and need treatment in order to either testify in their own defense or to be civilly committed because they're not capable of restoration. That's a big legal and moral obligation that we have in the behavioral health world. So those are some of the big ticket items I think that we're looking at in the Senate budget writing process.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicole Macri. I represent the 43rd Legislative District, which includes parts of Seattle, and am one of 3 vice chairs on the Appropriations Committee and part of the House Democrats operating budget writing team. And I think Senator Rolfes covered a lot of the priorities for Democrats. They are pretty consistent across the chambers. A few things I'll add is that, I'm not sure how much background you all have heard. I think some of you may know where we are in the legislative calendar. Tomorrow is our policy cutoff, so policy bills are being very seriously considered this week, and next week is our fiscal cutoff week. So the fiscal committees have the next 8 days to consider bills. And as Senator Rolfes says, we're in a relatively strong position as a state. That also means that we are going to have to make very strategic decisions about how we best meet the ongoing and emerging needs of Washington residents. And so we are scrutinizing all of these policy bills that have fiscal impact as they come through the fiscal committee. So the next 8 days will be fairly intense as we examine the policy bills. There will be long hours in both the House and Senate Ways and Means Committee and Appropriations Committee. As I heard one person say, we received the river of bills that are coming to our committee. I'll say the House Democrats' priorities align exactly with what Senator Rolfes says. So we're really focused on workforce, K-12, particularly special ed. Our schools are still struggling as they have just weathered this multi-year pandemic, and the impacts on our students have been pretty significant. There is a strong focus, a top priority for our caucus members on addressing homelessness, increasing access to affordable housing. In the House, we have a number of policy bills in that realm as well, in addition to just currently looking at the governor's suggested investments in those areas. Behavioral health continues to be a top priority, and again, the Blake, our work on kind of what we're going to do next relative to the Blake decision, and the True Blood case, which it continues to be a top issue as it's an open issue right now in the courts, are going to have significant impact in our thinking. I do want to say in housing, we're taking a comprehensive approach. We have a framework that we're calling supply, stabilization, and support. So how are we building the full range of housing supply across our communities, looking at bills like increasing the diversity of housing, streamlining permitting, and reducing requirements on new construction, like parking requirements. I'm also glad to say there's a lot of bipartisan work happening in that space, so we're very hopeful that we'll see some significant housing policy come through. We're hearing from our local governments about the potential impacts to change code, do planning, et cetera. And so from a budget perspective, we're considering what those kinds of policies, what kind of impacts they'll have on local government and what role the state should play in that. We are also focused on stabilizing folks who are at risk of being displaced from their housing, including homelessness. A little bit less of bipartisanship in that area, but we are looking at the immediate impacts of the high costs of rents on folks across the state. And Then more on the capital budget, I would say the support in terms of what role does the state have in continuing to invest in housing in our communities, especially for the lowest income people, people who are disabled, people who are homeless, et cetera. And then in workforce, my comms people gave me a cute little catchphrase as well, which we're calling streamline, pipeline, and bottom line. So when we think about our healthcare professions, in particular behavioral health, we want to streamline the process that people can receive the credentials that they need to best serve the full range of needs that we know our folks across communities are having relative to behavioral health. We want to increase that pipeline, so what's the training and support folks need, what's the cost to get education, and how are we supporting people to attract them in these helping professions where we know we're going to need a lot more workers today, but well into the future. And then bottom line, the governor has given us budget proposals that have rate increases in the Medicaid space to ensure that we are providing living wages for the many healthcare professionals who we are asking to take care of people with serious behavioral health conditions, people with serious disabilities, people who are older in our behavioral health and long-term care system, as well as in our child care system. So some highlights, and I'm sure you all have questions. Remember to get 6:30?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I'm Drew Stokesbury, state representative from the 31st District. I live in Auburn. I've got the ignominious distinction of being the only member of the House Republican Caucus who lives in King County. I've been the ranking Republican on the House Appropriations Committee since the 2019 session, so this is my fifth session doing it. I think Christine and Nicole outlined some of the broad issues that the legislature is going to be forced to confront. The vast majority of which aren't really ideological. Republicans agree that we want to fully fund K-12 education, ensure that every child, regardless of their zip code, has access to a world-class education that prepares them for college or career. That includes special education students, who are probably the ones most forgotten, most left behind by the latest iteration of McCleary and post-McCleary changes. Obviously no secret that our state's mental health system has seen its fair share of struggles, particularly at state institutions like DSHS. DSHS is Western State, Eastern State. So I think there's broad agreement that we need to continue to address that. I will correct Senator Rolfes on one thing. She said it was week 5, but I actually think it's week 6. And I don't know if that's good news or bad news. I mean, it's good news because we're closer to the end, but it's bad news because it means we have less time to figure all this out. But I will add one point from the Republican perspective. I was elected in 2014. At the time, the state's budget was less than $30 billion. When I ran for office for the first time, this budget will almost certainly be a $70 billion budget over the 2-year biennium. That's well over a 100% increase in about 8 or so years, depending on how exactly you want to count that timing. Not many of my constituents have seen their incomes double over 8 years. Not many small businesses have seen their revenue double over 8 years. The state has been very blessed financially to be the place where companies like Microsoft and Amazon and Boeing, before they decided to call home, and all of the other smaller businesses that make Boeing and Microsoft and Starbucks and Amazon the world-class companies they are. And so, that's not to say that there aren't individuals out there who are struggling, but the state economy in the aggregate has done very well, and it's made budget writers' job pretty easy. And so, through that, 2 points. One is that Washington is one of the only states in the country that has not provided broad-based tax relief to its citizens in the past couple of years. Those very deep red conservative states like California, New York, and Massachusetts all found a way to provide broad-based tax relief during the pandemic. I remain optimistic that Washington can be creative and figure out a way to do so. I'd like to continually remind my friends on the other side of the aisle that when we hear over and over again about how regressive our state's tax code is, you can fix that in 2 ways. You can fix it by taxing the people that you want to tax, or you can fix it by reducing taxes on those people that you think are too overburdened by tax. So the very first bill that was filed this session was filed by yours truly. House Bill 1000 would double the size of the working families tax credit, double the income threshold that individuals could earn and still qualify for that credit. Even a broad-based sales tax cut would provide tremendous relief to Washingtonians that are being hit really hard by inflation, and in many ways do pay a higher share of their income in taxes. So I think that there still is an opportunity to be creative with our budget writing, figure out programs that can be retooled and create some savings while still investing in the priorities that we all agree upon, like mental health and homelessness and things like that, and providing broad-based tax relief. And then the last point I'll make from my caucus perspective is, in addition to all that, I think we will continue to exercise our bully pulpit in the minority. By definition, we don't have votes to pass a budget, but, we're going to use our position to encourage the majority to make sure that the budgets they do pass are prudent and responsible, and don't set the state up for difficult times down the road. Like I said, so far we've been very blessed financially. The state's latest economic and revenue forecast continues to show state tax revenue going up, albeit maybe not at as high of a rate, but still increasing overall. But I think it's also fair to say that there's probably more uncertainty and volatility attached to that projection than normally. We're in these very, very strange economic times where companies that were growing very quickly just a year ago were suddenly laying off individuals. Employment growth remains below 1%. And so even if there is an ability to spend money on things that we agree are good, just because we can do something doesn't automatically mean we should do it. So our caucus is going to continue to urge for restraint and responsibility and long-term thinking beyond the 2-year period that we're appropriating for, and even beyond the 4-year period that we have to balance over. Because the way to make a recession worse when it inevitably comes, whether it's next week or 5 years from now, is to build a bunch of unsustainable programs that people think they can depend upon and then take that away in times they need it. So want to make sure we're being cautious and prudent and doing the best we can for the taxpayers of Washington State. And with that, I'll turn it over to my good friend and former colleague, Senator Gildan.
All right, well, thank you, Representative Stokesbury and Senator Walters and all the panel. It's good to see you again. It's been a while. So I am Chris Gildan, your state senator for the 25th Legislative District, which is centered in Puyallup. This is my first year as one of the budget writers. I'm the assistant ranking for Ways and Means, and I'm pinch hitting here today for our ranking member, Senator Linda Wilson. And so I won't take up too much time today. I'll be very brief, but you've heard a lot of the items where I think that we're going to come to agreement this year. I think that everyone agrees that we need to have responsible spending in our budget, that we need to increase our resources for behavioral health, for homelessness assistance, for substance use disorder treatment. We need to fully fund our K-12. We've got some work to do with workforce development. We've got a lot of work to do with finding ways to reduce the cost of housing for both owners and renters. And I'll just give you a little bit of perspective on, from my viewpoint as coming on as one of the budget writers for the very first time. And I'd like to give a little bit of kudos to Senator Rolfes as the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, because so far, Senator Wilson and I have been at the table every step of the way. It's been a very bipartisan effort. I feel like that we've been negotiating through the budget in good faith. I'm very appreciative of that. And I hope that we can continue to do that, because I'm very hopeful that for the first time in I don't know when, that we may be able to come to a bipartisan budget this year. And so I'm still holding out hope for that. One of the things that's out there floating that we're still going to have to contend with, obviously, is the capital gains tax and which way the Supreme Court is going to rule on that, because that could leave a big hole in our budget, depending on which way that the Supreme Court rules. So we'll find out about that. But as long as the process is moving forward as it has been, I'm very hopeful that we'll come together and we'll actually create a budget that shares all of our shared priorities. Because that's what it should be, right? The budget should reflect priorities. And I will give one little, bit of grace to Senator Rolfus, because she doesn't know what week it is, and I'll just say that's because she's been working from daylight till dark, and she's been keeping me there with her, so I don't know what week it is either, so thank you, Senator Rolfus.
There's pizza tonight.
And also too, I was, after she said I was very unconfident, I thought there's a good chance I was wrong, so I had to like count the weeks on the calendar to make sure.
We can take just a couple of quick questions, and then we've got to go to the transportation